A Charlotte Mason mother often busies herself rightly with efforts to nurture her children to grow in character, virtue, intellect, and wonder. We desire to present the best living books and ideas to our children because it is good for their souls. If we believe that what feeds the soul matters as much as what feeds the body, then what should we be feeding our souls? A steady diet of scripture, of course, is essential. And along with that, good books from great theologians, captivating stories to stoke our own imaginations and challenge our character, and enriching hobbies may just lead us to the good life, where we are image bearers, walking in our calling and glorifying God in the ordinary, everyday, magnificent moments. Let's talk about mother culture. Welcome to A Heart for Home Education. My name is America, mother to three, homeschooling in a Charlotte Mason and classical way. Today we're going to be talking about cultivating our own souls so that we can in turn cultivate the souls of our children. As mothers, so much depends on how we are taking care of our own selves so that we can in turn take care of our households and our children well. And a big piece of this for me is mother culture, maintaining habits in my daily routine that help me focus on what my mission is, what my task is, who I am in Christ, so that I can in turn cultivate the souls of my children. I need to be taking in good ideas just as much as my children need to be taking in good ideas. And there are many ways that we as mothers can do this. So today I'm going to be sharing some of the ways that I incorporate mother culture into my daily life, some of the things that I read, some of the things that I do, and habits that I have in place to make sure that I am cultivating my own soul so that I can in turn cultivate the souls of my children. In her book, Mother Culture, Karen Andriola talks about how mothers take care of a lot of people and a lot of things in our households, so we must take care of ourselves as well. In a me-first self-care culture, mother culture is different. The purpose of mother culture is that we may be fed by the Spirit of God through good ideas so that we can feed our children these same ideas. If living ideas and living books are good for our children, then they are also good for us as mothers. Now, in sharing with you these ideas today, I don't want you to get the impression that my life is some perfect picture of mother culture and having a quiet home where I can just read at my leisure and do whatever I want. That is not true. However, I may be in a different season of life than a lot of you. I have three beautiful, amazing children whom I adore. And later this month, the oldest will turn 9, and then the middle will turn 7, and my youngest just turned 5. I don't have any toddlers. I don't have any little ones running around as much as I would love to. But right now, the season of life that the Lord has me in is that I have three mostly independent children who still need my care and my love and my nurturing attention. But my children love playing together. They play really well together most of the time. They love being outside. They are fairly independent, and I give them lots of time to have unstructured free play. So that's the season of life I'm in. So some of these things may not apply to your life, but I hope there are tidbits and principles that you can apply to your life no matter what season of life you're in. So with that, let's get started. So how I set up my mother culture is I usually have 3 or 4 reads going on at once. So I have 4 categories. The first one is a stiff read, the second is a practical read, the third is a fiction, and the fourth is a theological or Sunday read. But also just keep in mind that I'm not terribly strict about books fitting into these categories. It's just kind of a guideline so that I'm not taking on too much. I'm also going to be showing you some examples of books that I have in each of these categories, books that I've read from these categories. Because if I come across a book and I realize I'm already reading a book in that category, then I will be sure to finish that book. And it's kind of some extra motivation to get that book finished so I can move on to another. And then I'm also going to show you how I try to plan out my year. Although I want you to know that I'm not that strict with my planning. Sometimes I will just hear about a book that I want to read and I will add it to my list and pick it up. So for the first category, a stiff read, that would include more challenging reads for me, such as Charlotte Mason. Charlotte Mason's writing is challenging to read. It's written in Victorian English, and I try to have one of her books going at all times. Right now, I am about to go through Parents and Children. Let me know in the comments below if you've read that, if you're reading it now, or what Charlotte Mason volume you might be reading now. So a stiff read is any reading that is going to challenge you, challenge your abilities as a reader, challenge some of your ideas as a person. I have this book going as well. This is The Law's Guide to Nature Drawing and Journaling by John Muir Laws. Now, this one is not a challenge to read. The language is very simple. However, the ideas are challenging me as a person. And it's more of an academic read in that it's a how-to guide of how to nature journal. The next category is the practical read. And for me, this mostly applies to homeschooling reads. I read a ton about homeschooling philosophy, encouragement for homeschooling mothers. So that's where they would fall in. This would also be any books about homemaking or any other skill that I am pursuing. Those kind of books would fall into this category. Just super practical, but still life-giving books. The third category that I have is fiction. I try to reserve this for the best of the best fiction. I'm trying to read through John Sr.'s 1,000 Good Books list. My dad read the Little House books to us when we were little girls, my older sister and I loved them then, and I was so excited to read them to my children. I did not expect how much they would change my life as an adult. The character Ma Ingalls from the Little House books is not without fault, of course, I know that, but she is an amazing example of a patient and loving mother and wife. I have learned so much from how she respects Pa as a father. She is a living picture to me of gentleness and patience and respect for her husband. She is not without flaw. I recognize that. I especially dislike the way that she talks about Indians, particularly, and my children and I have lots of conversations about that. But I, for the first time, was able to see how a living idea changes you. This living idea of Ma Ingalls and her character and her virtues really transformed the way that I parent and aspire to be in my marriage. There are so many other examples of life-giving literature. Little Women was life-changing for me. Reading about Marmee's gentleness, her patience, when she talks about being angry every day, yet she overcomes it. Reading about these beautiful pictures of women and mothers and wives and how they have allowed God to transform their lives, and the way that they treat others has been so life-giving to me, so challenging, so convicting, and it really made me rethink my perspective on fiction. I used to think fiction was just a treat and something that you could fit in, and I also wasn't making the best choices in my fiction reads. And now fiction is a priority for me. My fiction book is usually my favorite read at the moment, and I usually learn the most from my fiction books. Those books are the ones that change me the most because they get at the heart rather than just stuffing more information into my head. Now, all the books I read, I feel like are good, and I love all of them, but fiction books just change me in a different way. So I would encourage you to look at the books that you're reading, look at the fiction books you're reading, because I read one recently, I think it was last year. There was nothing particularly bad about the content, but there was no growth in these characters. This was one of like a bestseller of last year or the year before or something. There was no growth in these characters. There was no virtue in these characters. Essentially, nothing happened with the characters. It just was an action storyline. And we learn our character and our virtue from the books that we read, just like our children do. And the fourth category is a theological read. Now, most of the time, the books that I'm reading are all theological reads, but this is a category specifically for theological reads. Sometimes if my stiff or practical read is very theological in nature, then I won't have this fourth category going. I'll just focus on 3 reads at the time. But most of the time, that theological read is the one that I reserve to read on Sundays. As I was reading through Augustine's Confessions, that was a stiff theological read, and so that was covering both categories for me, and I was also reading that one on Sundays. So these categories help me to know if I have a good spread of books to be read, and then I also divide my readings by time of the day. So a lot of the times, my morning read will be a theological or a stiff read. My afternoon reading will be a stiff or a practical read, and my bedtime read will be my fiction read. So I hope this does not sound overwhelming to you. I am really just picking one book to read at a certain time slot. None of these are hard and fast categories or rules, or even rules that you need to do to be able to have the ideal mother culture. These are just my ideas and how I work this into my day. So for the stiff read category, I'm going to go through a couple of books that I have read either this year or recently that fell into my stiff category. So the first is Home Education by Charlotte Mason, Towards a Philosophy of Education, of Charlotte Mason squarely into the stiff read for me. The Victorian English is challenging to read, so this is usually my stiff read is a Charlotte Mason read. Being Love by Karen Glass is basically a paraphrasing of home education, and it's very helpful. It is much easier to read, but this would kind of be a borderline read for me that could fall into the stiff read category. The Lost Tools of Learning. This is very quick. This is one that requires a little bit more attention, I would say, not because the language is more difficult, but just more attention because the ideas are bigger ideas. Now, this is a good example of a book that falls into the stiff read category and also the theological and Sunday read category. This is Knowing God by J.I. Packer, and this one is a more difficult read. It has just language that's a little bit more challenging, theological ideas that are a little bit more challenging. So this is a good example of one that can fall into two categories. The Last Child in the Woods. This is a great book. This, I would say, is what got me started in the Charlotte Mason world. So it's not the language that's challenging about this as much as the content and all of the studies that the author pulls into the book. It is just a stiffer read. And then this is another excellent example of a stiff read blending with a theological and Sunday read. This is the original version of the Pilgrim's Progress, the John Bunyan Pilgrim's Progress. Up next is my practical reads, and a lot of these fall into the practical or theological Sunday reads. So this one, Mere Motherhood, that I read in August, is one of my favorite books, I think. I absolutely loved this one. So this for me was my practical and my theological, and it was so enjoyable that sometimes it felt like my fiction read. And so this one is kind of a memoir from Cindy Rollins, a homeschooling mother, and it falls into the homeschooling practical read for me. And then she had so much theology in here that it also fell into my Sunday read. For the Children's Sake, this book is incredible, and I highly recommend it as kind of the first step into the Charlotte Mason education world. This is definitely solidly in my practical reads. Know and Tell, The Art of Narration by Karen Glass. This is another practical read helping you develop the skills of narration in your children. This is Honey for a Child's Heart by Gladys Hunt, I believe. This is a wonderful book about reading living books to your children. I highly recommend this one. Very practical read. Teaching from Rest. I've already talked about this one a lot. This is an incredible practical read. This also touches on a lot of theology, kind of what does God think of education. So I love this book. Up next is Awaking Wonder by Sally Clarkson. Most of Sally Clarkson's books fit into this practical category, practical motherhood reads, but this is also a theology read. It is talking about our calling as mothers, and this is a beautiful book. I have two more Sally Clarkson books that I would highly, highly recommend, especially for the little years. These ones, I don't even know which one I would pick first, but these ones are incredible. If you have littles at home, not homeschooling yet, this is where I would start. The Mission of Motherhood and the Ministry of Motherhood. These are incredible reads. And these all are very practical, but the thing is that there's really no divide between the secular practical element of homeschooling. There's nothing secular about my homeschool, and there's no divide between homeschooling and theology. They are one to me. My relationship with the Lord, these two elements of my life are so interwoven that I really could not separate them. So that's why a lot of these have a lot of crossover, this practical and the theological, because the theological impacts the practical so much that any book that I'm reading, the author is wise enough to know that theology impacts the practical. M is for Mama. This is an amazing book. I really like this one. It's a newer book. I went through it with some ladies at church, but this one is really good for the little years or if you are homeschooling. We just had a cloud kind of disrupt our sunlight, so I've switched up the lighting, but this is You Are What You Love by James K.A. Smith. This is hard to pick between stiff and practical. Stiff only because the ideas are so challenging. Next up is my fiction reads. So I've got Little Women here, The Awakening of Miss Prim. This is an amazing book. I was so surprised at how good this was. I had heard some recommendations in Common House, and that is Autumn Kern's Patreon type group. It's a mighty network. And for some reason, I was not intrigued by it, but I decided to pick it up because I needed a book, and I picked it up and it was amazing. I loved it so much. Till We Have Faces. I was also surprised at how much I enjoyed this one, how powerful this one was for me. And I'm still chewing on the ideas in this book. And this book, there are still some things in both of these books that still give me pause, that still come to my memory. I think these ones both in the early summer, so it's been months since I've finished these. But I still have so many ideas from these that I'm chewing on and working through and thinking about. So both of these are really, really good books that I recommend. Pride and Prejudice. I read some of the Narnia books just by myself because I wasn't ready to read them to my children yet. It just wasn't fitting in our schedule. It's not that I need to hold off or anything. So I read some of these on my own. I also read the ending books of the Little House series where Laura and Almanzo get married. And I just didn't think my kids would care or be interested in that type of story yet. So I read these on my own and I loved them. I loved the ending of the Little House series. That might be one of my favorite books that I read this entire year was these happy golden years, the last Little House book. I absolutely loved the story. It was so romantic and so beautiful and such a beautiful encapsulation of Laura's time at home and how that was coming to a close, her time being under Ma and Pa's roof coming to a close. It was very emotional for me. And so I just want to encourage you that, if these books are good for your kids, they're also good for you. I plan to read Secret Garden and Anne of Green Gables on my own. I want to know those stories that everyone talks about. And so don't be afraid to read these books because if they're good for your children, they're good for you. Another element of mother culture is pursuing hobbies. I've always loved watercolor painting ever since I was in high school and I took an advanced art class. I just fell in love with watercolor painting specifically. And so that is something that I pursue on my own and with the children. I do brush drawing lessons right along with them, but I also try to reserve time for just myself to be watercolor painting. That doesn't always work out. I'll usually have my daughter join me if she sees me watercolor painting, and that's just fine. But the point is that it is time spent pursuing a hobby just for the sake of pursuing a hobby and pursuing true leisure. As image bearers of God, God is a creator, and so we ought to be creating as well. If you are pregnant or nursing a little one, then I would not worry about this. You are already creating a lot. You're creating life in your womb. You're creating breast milk. You are forming a little human, nourishing that little human. And so this would be one thing that I would set aside during a postpartum period, unless it's something that's really, really life-giving for you. If I were blessed to be in a postpartum season again, then I would probably set aside these kind of handicraft hobbies just for a season, knowing that I'll be able to pick it back up when I'm out of that season. Another hobby that I have recently picked up is knitting. This is a brand new hobby. I am like a little zygote of a baby in the knitting world, but I have learned to knit. I've taught myself to knit, but this is something that has been super fun, super life-giving. I've really loved how calming it is, and I also really enjoy that it is a crossing the midline motion, which is really good for children who are struggling to learn how to read. And so this has been an amazing activity for us as a family. But that is just one of those hobbies that is really life-giving because I'm creating, I'm using my hands, I'm not just sitting idle. And it's just been really, really enjoyable for me. And I've brought it with me to places. I am that homeschooling mom, apparently, bringing my knitting places, but I don't care. It's been really fun and I've really, really enjoyed it. So I want to encourage you, mother, to have a hobby to pursue. Now, the other element of mother culture is things that just happen naturally throughout our day. So I take the children out on a nature walk, and that is feeding and life-giving to my soul. I read a really good book with the children, and that is life-giving to my soul. That gives me good ideas. As homeschooling mothers, if we are presenting our children with really life-giving ideas, then those life-giving ideas pour into us as well. And so I would encourage you to look at what you are reading. What are you feeding your soul through social media, through television, through books, through podcasts, through music? What are you feeding your soul? Are you listening to a lot of music that doesn't glorify God, that has untrue ideas in it, selfish ideas in it? These ideas will seep into other areas of our lives, and they are not as life-giving as the ideas that we could be pursuing. Another aspect of mother culture is just being able to put in the time for it. If you are a postpartum mom, or you're pregnant, or you just have a lot of really little kids, maybe you can only fit in one book into your day, and that's totally fine. 15 minutes of reading a life-giving book each day, maybe while you are wearing a baby and swaying at the kitchen counter so that the baby stays asleep, and maybe your toddlers are napping, and you're able to read 3 pages of a Sally Clarkson book. That is feeding your soul, and that will feed your soul more than scrolling on TikTok or Instagram, because these short reels are only seconds worth of an idea, whereas an author like Sally Clarkson has put hundreds of hours into this book to develop ideas, to come up with beautiful language, to fully develop an idea and not just have a 60-second clip of an idea that robs us of the whole informing idea and just puts a little tidbit, enough for you to say you liked that video. I would challenge you that you probably can reduce your scrolling and pick up a book instead, or pick up your knitting instead, or take a nature walk instead. I say this as a friend, as someone who personally struggles still, because the world is so good at trying to fight for our attention. The world and all of the algorithms fight for our attention. They fight for our love. They fight for our worship. And are we going to give into that day after day? Or are we going to go for the better thing, the thing that is true and praiseworthy and noble and beautiful and inspiring and life-giving, the thing that will help us pursue cultivating our own souls and cultivating the souls of our children? Another part of my mother culture routine is my commonplace notebook. I've had this one for a couple of years, and it's held up really well. This is a book of my favorite quotes and ideas from books that I've read, and it's kind of a notebook, a journey through all of the books that I've read over the past couple of years and all of my favorite quotes from them. So if I own a book, I am constantly highlighting, underlining, starring things, and I will dog ear the corner if I want to put it in my commonplace book. Charlotte Mason would have called this book maybe a book of mottos, but this is just my favorite quotes, my favorite, most inspiring ideas go in here. Books that help me be a better person, a better mother, a better wife, they all go into here. So I cannot mark that a book is fully read until I have taken all of those quotes that I want to put in here and have finalized it in my commonplace book. That's when a book is finished to me, is once I've read it and then I go back through and kind of digest it a second time and get all of those inspiring ideas and put it here in my commonplace book. It is such a treat to be able to go back through here, through all the years of all the things that I've read and all my favorite parts of things that I've read, and just see them and have them reform me and reshape me every time I visit them. It's like visiting with an old friend. So I adore the habit of a commonplace book. I like to do it on Sundays because it kind of helps me to reflect on all the things that I've learned that week, all the things that the Lord has shown me through my readings. I have even put in commonplace quotes from podcasts or sermons or songs. I have poems in here. I have some things in here from Autumn Kern's courses over at Common House. I just have all of the good ideas that I encounter, probably not all of them, but all of the ones that really grip me. I will bookmark them in an audiobook form, or I will bookmark them in my books and then come back and put them in here. And then another part of my mother culture time is intentionally having quiet, intentionally turning off the audiobooks and the podcasts and just doing the dishes in quiet, because ultimately quiet leads to contemplation, and contemplation leads to prayer. And so I really try and have to fight sometimes, fight my own desire to constantly have a stream of incoming stimulation and knowledge, useful, good things a lot of the time, but contemplation and prayer are better. And so I really fight to have quiet and peaceful times throughout my day. And that has made a lot of difference in my mother culture routine. So that is what my mother culture looks like in this season of life. It is something that I treasure, that I enjoy, that brings me closer to the Lord. As much as I prioritize all of these things, I want to be clear that I cannot get to these things every single day. or every single week. So my daily habits, I hope I'm doing those mostly every day. And I have in my planner a spot to record if I've done it or not. But real life happens. Sometimes we have doctor's appointments. Sometimes something comes up that we weren't expecting and I don't have time to fit it in that day. I don't beat myself up over it. I just reflect on it and carry on, and hopefully the next day I can get to it. As long as I'm still prioritizing it and it's not something that I'm just blowing off, which I have had seasons where I've just chosen to blow it off and not pursue those things and give in to what the world is pushing at me. And I have had those seasons. I find that I always come back to this life-giving practice because it's for my best interest and it's also for the best interest of my family. When I am nourishing my soul, there is such a difference in our home. There's such a difference in our peace and our joy. And if I feel convinced that my children need to feast on living ideas, I ought to also feel convinced that I need to as well. Thank you so much for watching. Please let me know how you handle mother culture below. Let me know if you have read some of the books that I've shared, or if now you're adding them to your to be read list. I love hearing from you. I love talking to you all in the comments, so please share. Thank you so much for being here, and I will see you in the next one.